Hey guys, today we begin with a giant squid drifting beneath midnight Nordic waves, its long arms pulsing like slow thunder. We'll slip into a sun-bleached Greek cave where a tiny elephant skull once birthed the legend of one-eyed Cyclopes. And we'll stroll through Komodo's rust-red dusk beside a living dragon whose venomous bite still humbles the island. But before you get comfortable, please make sure to like the video and subscribe if you genuinely appreciate the work I do here. And please let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, put your phone or TV remote out of reach, and let's move into tonight's journey together. For centuries, Nordic sailors navigated their wooden vessels through midnight waters that concealed secrets beneath their obsidian surface. On starless nights, when the sea and sky merged into a single darkness, weathered hands would grip the ship's rail tighter. Voices dropped to whispers as tales passed between generations of seaman stories of arms that could rise from unfathomable depths to embrace an entire ship, dragging it into the abyss. The legend of the Kraken haunted these waters like a phantom melody. Fishermen returning to harbors spoke of momentary stillness, when waves would flatten unnaturally and birds would cease their calling, the prelude, they claimed, to something vast stirring below. In taverns from Oslo to Reykjavik, sailors charted invisible territories on maps, marking regions where ships disappeared without trace, swallowed by what they believed was no storm, but something alive, patient and hungry. Some claimed to have glimpsed pale flesh beneath churning waters, massive and ghostly, before quickly changing course. At night, they would listen for a distinctive sound, not quite a heartbeat, but a slow, rhythmic pulse that seemed to emanate from the ocean itself. Medieval ship logs, recovered from vessels that survived these northern passages, contain curious entries written in shaking script. A Dutch merchant in 1643 described what he called a living island that surfaced briefly alongside his ship, breathing like a man though large as a hillside. A Portuguese captain in 1531 detailed what modern historians long dismissed as delusion, an ink-black waterstorm that emerged not from clouds but from depths, staining the sea with darkness that smelled of earth and metal. These accounts often shared a common feature: the sense that what they encountered was not merely animal but something possessed of ancient intelligence. Norwegian texts speak of arm stars that would briefly appear on the surface, what we now recognize as the radial spread of giant squid tentacles. Fishermen would sometimes haul up fragments of strange flesh, rubbery and dense, that would quickly decompose on deck. Monks tasked with recording these findings noted how the pieces would continue to shimmer with faint, bluish light, long after being separated from their source, a phenomenon we now understand as bioluminescent bacteria feeding on squid tissue. It wasn't until 2004 that human eyes finally witnessed what had been swimming through nightmares for millennia. Japanese researchers, after numerous failed attempts, captured the first images of a living giant squid in its natural habitat. The footage, grainy and dreamlike, revealed not a monster but something almost balletic, an enormous creature, drifting through midnight waters like a silent zeppelin, tentacles trailing behind it in graceful arcs. Later expeditions would improve on these images, until by 2019, high-definition cameras captured these beings in their full glory. Eyes, the size of dinner plates, gazing into the lens with what seemed like ancient curiosity. The Architeuthis, to give it its scientific name, moved not with violent thrashing but with hypnotic undulation, propelling its massive form through pressure-crushed depths with surprising gentleness. Scientists observed how they would float, almost motionless, conserving energy in an environment where food might be encountered only once every several weeks. A slow, patient existence that might explain the pulse sailors claimed to feel through their ship hulls. The gulf between myth and reality finds perhaps its clearest expression in how we've measured these creatures. For centuries, sailors who discovered beach squid carcasses would stretch the deteriorating tentacles to impossible lengths, not out of deliberate deception, but through misunderstanding of the tissue's elasticity after death. Partial remains would be assembled into impossible anatomies. A beak found in 1874 near Cornwall was estimated to belong to a squid over 60 feet, in length of measurement, we now know to be exaggerated by nearly 3 times. The creature's defensive mechanism sits, ability to expel massive clouds of ink when threatened transformed in sailors' accounts to deliberate attempts to capsize ships, while the squid's powerful suckers, designed to grip slippery prey, became hooks capable of puncturing oak hulls. Even into the 20th century, naval architects took seriously accounts of giant squid attacks when designing vessels for certain routes, reinforcing hulls against a threat that had never materialized in documented history. What emerges when we compare the mythic terror to the biological reality is something perhaps more wondrous than frightening. The creature that inspired centuries of maritime dread lives a twilight existence of remarkable tranquility. The giant squid moves through its deep-sea domain not as a marauder but as a spectral presence, embodying the patience of evolutionary success over 300 million years of nearly unchanged existence. Its enormous eyes, which once featured in tales as gleaming with malevolence, are actually adaptations to capture the faintest traces of light in an environment we can barely comprehend. The kraken of legend was said to rise from depths with violent intention. The Architeuthis rises only when dying, its ammonium-filled tissues becoming less dense as life ebbs away. Perhaps what sailors truly encountered were these final moments, the gentle ascent of ancient beings, completing their life cycle beneath passing ships, their massive forms briefly bridging 2 worlds before sinking once more into myth and memory. The Mediterranean sun beats down on limestone cliffs, bleaching them the color of old bones. On certain Greek islands, hidden within shadowed recesses of these pale formations, early travelers made a discovery that would echo through millennia of storytelling. They found skulls, strange, unsettling skulls, with what appeared to be a single, perfectly round eye socket centered in the middle of the forehead. These hollow-eyed remains stared back at the discoverers from the darkness of island caves, silent witnesses to a history far older than human memory could trace. The eye socket, so perfectly positioned where human imagination would later place the single eye of mythical giants, was in reality something else entirely, the nasal cavity where an elephant's trunk once connected to its skull. But to ancient Greeks, unfamiliar with elephants and finding these remains in remote coastal grottos, the conclusion seemed obvious. These were the skulls of the fearsome one-eyed giants, the Cyclopes. The scale of these skulls, while large by human standards, didn't match the towering proportions described in later myths. This disconnect between physical evidence and mythological stature speaks to the human tendency to expand upon mystery, to build narrative layers atop the foundation of the unexplained. Each retelling added height to the giants, breadth to their shoulders, and ferocity to their appetites. When Homer composed the Odyssey in the 8th century BCE, he described the Cyclops Polyphemus as a solitary shepherd, dwelling in coastal caves far from civilization, subsisting on cheese, milk, and occasionally unfortunate sailors. This portrait, the lonely, monstrous shepherd living in limestone grottos, mirrors precisely the environment where these skulls were discovered. The coastal caves of islands like Sicily and Crete, with their labyrinthine chambers carved by millennia of wave action, became the perfect dwelling places for Homer's imagined monsters. These caverns, formed through the patient erosion of limestone by salt water and time, preserved the remains that would otherwise have been scattered by scavengers or broken down by exposure. The same isolated quality that made these caves ideal preservationists also made them perfect settings for tales of monsters. Remote, echoing with strange sounds as waves crashed against distant chambers, these natural formations became theaters for the imagination, places where shadows could conceal giants, where strange bones could suggest inhuman forms. The true origin of these mysterious skulls remained unknown until relatively recently, when paleontologists began systematically studying the phenomenon of island dwarfism and gigantism. On islands, where resources are limited and predators often absent, evolution takes curious turns. Large mainland species often become smaller, conserving energy where food is scarce. This is precisely what happened to the elephants that once populated Mediterranean islands. Over generations, these island-bound elephants shrank. The largest mainland elephants once stood nearly 4 meters tall at the shoulder, but their island descendants gradually diminished to heights of less than 1 meter. Despite their reduced stature, these pygmy elephants retained proportionally large skulls, an evolutionary quirk that would later confuse human discoverers. Their remains, preserved in coastal caves where they sought shelter or where their bodies washed after death, created the perfect conditions for misinterpretation. Paleontologists can now trace the lineage of these dwarf elephants: Palaeoloxodon falconeri on Sicily and Malta, Elephas tiliensis on Telos. They've mapped the gradual reduction in size across generations, observed the retention of certain features like the distinctive nasal cavity. Through careful analysis of bone density, growth patterns, and comparative anatomy, scientists have reconstructed the story of these diminutive pachyderms that once roamed island meadows, browsing on Mediterranean vegetation, their trunks grasping at olive branches, their small frames navigating terrain that would have challenged their larger ancestors. The transformation from elephant skull to Cyclops legend followed a path as winding as the coastal grottos themselves. First came discovery, Greek sailors or settlers stumbling upon these strange remains in shadowed caves. Then confusion. What creature could have possessed such an unusual feature? Without knowledge of elephants or their anatomy, the single central opening suggested a single eye socket. From confusion grew speculation, from speculation emerged stories, and from stories, myths crystallized. Around evening fires, as Mediterranean winds whispered against stone dwellings, these tales would be told in hushed tones. Children would edge closer to their parents as storytellers described the fearsome giants who once roamed their islands, solitary, aggressive, man-eating monsters cast out by the gods themselves. These bedtime monsters, born from misunderstood anatomy, became cautionary tales against wandering too far, exploring unknown caves, or traveling alone along certain coastal paths. The Cyclops transitioned from fireside tale to literary figure, from local legend to cornerstone of Western mythology. And all the while, in quiet caves along the bone-white coast, more elephant skulls waited to be discovered, their empty nasal cavities staring outward like unblinking eyes, perpetuating the myth for generations of new finders. In this way, the smallest elephant species in the fossil record gave rise to some of the largest characters in mythological history, a transformation as remarkable as evolution itself. The Indonesian archipelago bathes in golden light as another day surrenders to twilight. On Komodo Island, something ancient stirs. A creature of impossible patience emerges from the shadows, rust-red scales catching the last reluctant rays of sunlight as it moves with the quiet confidence of an apex predator who has never needed to hurry. The Komodo dragon, largest lizard on our small blue planet, flicks a yellow-forked tongue into the evening air, tasting molecules that tell stories our human senses could never comprehend. Its claws press into volcanic soil that remembers when these islands were merely dreams beneath the waves. Local villagers have always given these creatures wide berth, whispering tales of their deadly bite, not knowing that modern science would eventually discover a mouth teeming with toxic bacteria and venom glands that ensure even the slightest wound becomes a death sentence delivered in slow motion. As darkness settles across the landscape, the dragon's eyes reflect starlight with the same unnerving stillness that has greeted countless moons across millennia. The creature's breathing creates small dust clouds in the dry season air, a gentle rhythm unchanged since before humans first set foot on these shores. 12 centuries earlier, and thousands of miles away, Tang dynasty travelers returned to imperial China with journals filled with wonders. Among sketches of strange fruits and foreign architecture were hurried drawings of massive lizards said to breathe clouds of death from gaping jaws. These merchant explorers, practical men unaccustomed to flights of fancy, insisted that on distant islands they had witnessed creatures that seemed pulled directly from ancestral legends, living dragons that lounged beneath tropical trees rather than soaring through mythical skies. Court scholars pored over these accounts with equal measures of fascination and skepticism. How convenient that dragons, those symbols of imperial power and cosmic harmony, should be discovered living in distant lands, just as tales of domestic dragons were fading into folklore. The emperor himself requested more detailed information, sending envoys with specific instructions to document these beasts. Returning sailors brought tales of lizards that grew longer than 3 men laid end to end, with claws that could disembowel a water buffalo and a bite that brought fever and certain death. Artists labored over scrolls depicting these hill dragons, never quite capturing the uncanny stillness of the genuine article, always adding subtle embellishments that nudged reality closer to legend: a slightly more serpentine neck, eyes with a hint more intelligence, smoke suggested around flaring nostrils. Further west, along the windswept passages of the ancient Silk Road, nomadic peoples occasionally unearthed massive bones protruding from eroded hillsides. These weathered remains, femurs thick as tree trunks, vertebrae large enough to serve as stools, rib cages that could shelter entire families from desert storms, sparked wonder and fear in equal measure. Travelers paid handsomely for fragments to carry home as proof of incredible encounters, while local storytellers wove elaborate tales explaining how such magnificent creatures came to be buried beneath shifting sands. What these wanderers couldn't know was that they were handling the fossilized remains of creatures that had vanished from Earth tens of millions of years before the first human ancestors stood upright. Dinosaur bones, pressed into stone by the patient weight of time, emerged into human consciousness not as scientific specimens but as physical evidence, confirming humanity's oldest stories. Chinese physicians ground these dragon bones into medicinal powders, while European alchemists dissolved them in acid, seeking to unlock the mythical properties surely contained within remains of such legendary beasts. Each culture that encountered these silent testimonies of prehistoric life interpreted them through the lens of their own mythology, finding precisely the validation they expected. And so our understanding moves at three distinct paces, each revealing something profound about our relationship with the natural world. First, the measured stride of the Komodo dragon, a living fossil that prowls through modern days carrying evolutionary memories from when mammals were still small, skittish things hiding in ecological shadows. Then, the silent testimony of actual fossils, their stories written in stone and requiring patient scientific translation to reveal worlds we can scarcely imagine. Finally, there moves the warm afterglow of myth, how human minds have always reached for narrative threads to weave unexplainable encounters into tapestries of meaning that satisfy our need for order. As night fully embraces Komodo Island, our dragon settles into a hollow where Earth still holds the day's warmth. Its ancient body conserves energy with remarkable efficiency, heartbeats slowing to a meditative rhythm. Tomorrow will unfold much as today did, and the day before that, a continuation of a success story written in genes that have remained largely unchanged for millions of years. No fire issues from its mouth, no treasure lies beneath its claws, yet something undeniably magical persists in this creature's stubborn existence, a living bridge connecting us to worlds long vanished and stories our ancestors told when night fell and shadows danced by firelight. As twilight settles over ancient steppes, imagine witnessing a massive, shaggy beast with a single horn protruding from its forehead, moving through tall grasses like a living shadow from another time. Not fantasy, but Elasmotherium, a prehistoric rhinoceros whose fossil remains tell us of a creature that actually roamed our world. Meanwhile, across vast deserts, slender white antelopes with twin spears rising from their heads create wavering silhouettes against the horizon that, when viewed from afar in shimmering heat, appear as something altogether magical. The unicorn myth persists across cultures not merely because humans crave magic, but because scattered throughout our natural world were actual creatures whose characteristics, when viewed through the fog of distance, limited scientific understanding, and our innate desire for wonder, transformed into something both more and less than what they truly were. The Elasmotherium, sometimes called the Siberian unicorn, stood nearly 7 feet tall at the shoulder, with a massive build that would dwarf a modern rhinoceros. Its most striking feature, the feature that would lodge itself in human imagination for millennia, was the single enormous horn that rose from its forehead. Unlike modern rhino horns made of keratin, this protrusion may have stretched up to 6 feet in length, creating a profile that, even to our modern eyes, appears otherworldly. These creatures wandered the Eurasian steppes until surprisingly recently, with the latest evidence suggesting they survived until around 35,000 years ago, meaning our ancestors would have encountered them, perhaps even hunted them, and certainly told stories about them around evening fires. the Arabian oryx presents us with the opposite end of the unicorn spectrum, not massive but elegant, not prehistoric but contemporary. These graceful antelopes, with their brilliant white coats, seem to float across desert landscapes, their twin horns so straight and positioned in such a way that, when viewed in profile against bright light, they appear to be a single spire rising from the forehead. To ancient travelers crossing vast deserts, dehydrated and weary, these animals must have seemed like apparitions, their forms taking on mythic qualities. When described by those who had glimpsed them briefly from afar, their features would naturally shift and transform with each retelling, adding layers to the unicorn tapestry being woven across continents. The human propensity for embellishment found another curious tributary feeding the unicorn legend, the humble narwhal. These Arctic whales carry a single spiraled tusk that can grow up to 10 feet long, actually an elongated canine tooth protruding through the upper lip. Traders along the Silk Road, ever eager to profit from mystery, collected these tusks when they fell into their hands, polishing them to perfection and selling them as genuine alicorn unicorn horn claiming extraordinary medicinal properties. Kings and emperors paid fortunes for these supposed unicorn horns, believing them capable of neutralizing poison, curing melancholy, and extending life itself. The horns were ground into powders, formed into cups believed to neutralize any poison poured within, and displayed as treasures beyond measurable, while narwhals continued their peaceful existence in northern waters, unaware of their contribution to one of history's most persistent myths. Medieval bestiaries, those lavishly illustrated catalogues of animals both real and imagined, further cemented the unicorn in our collective imagination. Monks laboring in quiet scriptoria would transcribe descriptions not from direct observation but from ancient texts themselves based on hearsay, a game of historical telephone stretching across centuries. In these manuscripts, unicorns were described with the reverence usually reserved for religious symbols, pure creatures that could only be captured by a virgin maiden, whose horn could purify poisoned waters with a single touch. The illustrations accompanying these descriptions showed creatures with the body of a horse, sometimes the beard of a goat, and that singular, magnificent hornal rendered in rich pigments and delicate gold leaf that seemed to shimmer in candlelight. What makes these bestiaries particularly fascinating is how they existed at the intersection of observed reality and unquestioned fantasy. The same pages that described unicorns would include reasonably accurate depictions of lions, elephants, and other creatures the illustrators had never personally seen but had received more reliable descriptions of. The boundaries between the mundane and the magical were permeable in these texts, just as they were in the medieval mind. Perhaps the most telling aspect is that even when real animals, the elasmotherium, the oryx, even distant glimpses of rhinos might have inspired these unicorn tales, the resulting mythology transcended its origins, becoming something that spoke to deeper human needs, for purity in an impure world, for magic in the mundane, for creatures that might carry meanings beyond their physical forms. As you drift towards sleep tonight, consider how the boundaries between the real and the imagined have always been fluid, how actual creatures glimpsed through the haze of distance and desire transformed into something that continues to captivate us, even now, when we can distinguish clearly between fossil record and folklore. Along the ancient banks of the Nile, where time seemed to flow in rhythm with the river's gentle pulse, stood temples adorned with murals that whispered stories older than memory itself. Among these painted tales, one creature appeared with remarkable frequency, the Bennu, not quite the phoenix of Greek imagination, but something altogether more tangible, more real. The Egyptians observed this large, elegant heron, with its distinctive crest and long, graceful neck, appearing precisely when the life-giving floods began to rise. Each year, as predictable as the stars themselves, this magnificent bird would appear when the waters swelled, seeming to emerge from nowhere, as if born anew from some unseen realm. The temple walls tell us how the priests tracked these appearances, noting how the Bennu's arrival coincided with the inundation that brought fertile silt to parched fields. In their eyes, this wasn't coincidence but cosmic significance, a creature so attuned to the cycle of renewal that it became renewal incarnate. The priests observed how these birds would build their nests high above the floodplains, creating islands of life amid the rising waters. When young herons emerged, their timing perfectly matched the retreat of the floods and the emergence of new growth. Is it any wonder, then, that the Egyptians saw in this bird not just an animal, but a divine messenger cycling with the sun itself, dying and being reborn with each annual flood? The myth and the reality blended seamlessly, like twilight merging into night. Yet the Bennu was not alone in inspiring the phoenix mythology that would later capture human imagination across continents. Far to the south, across the golden expanse of African savannas, another bird performed a transformation so striking that those who witnessed it could not help but speak of rebirth and renewal. The bateleur eagle, with its vibrant coloration and remarkable aerial displays, undergoes a fascinating metamorphosis as it ages. Young bateleurs possess dark plumage, almost coal-like in its depth, but as the years pass, and here is where our story grows curious, their feathers begin to change. The transformation is gradual, like watching the sky lighten at dawn. First, subtle russet tones emerge along the edges of wings. Then, as if touched by some internal flame, the plumage begins to redden. By full maturity, the bateleur's back and wings display a rich, burnt crimson that catches the light of the setting sun like embers glowing in a dying fire. Most remarkable is how these birds ride the thermal currents that rise from sun-baked earth. With wings outstretched and barely moving, they spiral upward on invisible columns of warm air, higher and higher, until they seem to touch the very sun itself. To early observers, this behavior, combined with their fiery transformation from dark to bright plumage, evoked nothing less than a bird burning itself in solar flame, only to emerge renewed. The science speaks of molting and pigmentation, but the poetry speaks of death and rebirth, of fire and restoration. Across cultures that encountered these birds, curious practices emerged. Ritual ash piles carefully maintained in temples and sacred spaces. Archaeologists once presumed these were purely symbolic, representing the mythical phoenix nest of cinnamon twigs and ash. But careful examination revealed fragments of molted feathers, carefully collected and preserved. The ancients were not merely telling stories, they were documenting observed phenomena through the lens of their understanding. The gentle science of avian molting tells us that birds must regularly shed and replace their feathers, a process as natural as breathing yet filled with mystery. Unlike mammals, who replace their hair gradually and continuously, many birds undergo dramatic, periodic molts. During these times, they become vulnerable, sometimes retreating to sheltered places until new feathers emerge. The discarded plumage, especially from birds like the bateleur or the sacred Bennu, was collected by priests who noted the varying colors and conditions with meticulous care. These collections served multiple purposes: divination tools, astronomical calendars, and records of natural cycles. The ancients understood something profound about renewal that we in our haste sometimes forget, that transformation requires both an ending and a beginning, a surrender and a becoming. The phoenix myth captures this wisdom in its imagery of fire and ash, death and rebirth. As twilight settles across our story, we might imagine those ancient observers, watching birds spiral upward on thermal currents, their red feathers catching the last light of day. In that moment, science and mythos were not separate languages but different dialects speaking the same truth, that nature's cycles contain all the magic and wonder we could ever need, if only we have eyes to see and patience to observe. The phoenix was never merely a myth. It was a poetic understanding of a natural phenomenon, dressed in the language of wonder that lets us see the extraordinary within the ordinary. Imagine yourself walking along ancient caravan trails that wind through the Gobi Desert of Mongolia. The sun beats down on your skin as your boots sink slightly into the ochre-colored sand. These paths have been carved by centuries of travelers, merchants seeking exotic goods from distant lands. But there's something else hidden in these wind-swept ridges, something that connects our world to the realm of myth. As you walk, you might notice strange shapes emerging from the eroded hillsides, smooth, curved objects, partially buried in the sand. If you brush away the grit, you'd find yourself staring at what appears to be a beaked skull, roughly the size of a sheep's head, but with peculiar frills extending backward from its cranium. These aren't random formations, they're fossils, millions of years old, and they might explain one of history's most persistent legendary creatures. The locals have known about these remains for thousands of years. Long before modern paleontology, nomadic peoples crossing these windswept plains would stumble upon these strange skulls poking out from the ridges. They didn't have our scientific framework, but they had something equally powerful: imagination and oral tradition. These discoveries became woven into their understanding of the world. Now, let's travel westward, following the ancient Silk Road to where the steppes meet the edges of the Greek world. Here, in trading posts where east met west, Scythian merchants would gather after arduous journeys across Central Asia. The Scythians were horsemen and traders, moving between Mongolia and the Black Sea. And they carried stories, tales of creatures they'd heard about or perhaps glimpsed fossils of themselves. Among these tales was that of the griffin, a majestic beast with the body of a lion and the head and wings of an eagle. In Scythian art, these creatures appear as guardians of gold, fiercely protecting precious metal deposits in the deserts and mountains to the east. Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, recorded these accounts, describing griffins as four-legged beasts with eagle-like beaks that guarded gold in the far northern lands. The griffins weren't just casual mentions, they became central figures in art and mythology across Eurasia. Golden griffin statues adorned Scythian tombs. Greek vessels depicted them as noble, fearsome creatures. Their image spread as far as Persia and Egypt. For thousands of years, the griffin was accepted not as fantasy but as a real animal that existed in those distant, mysterious eastern lands that few Greeks or Romans would ever visit. But why would such a specific creature emerge in these tales? Why not simply invent a dragon or some other wholly imaginary beast? The answer may lie in those beaked skulls in the Mongolian desert. In the 1920s, American paleontologist Roy Chapman Andrews led expeditions into the Gobi Desert. There, his team discovered incredible dinosaur fossils, including a creature called Protoceratops. About the size of a sheep, this dinosaur had a parrot-like beak, a bony frill extending from the back of its skull, and a four-legged stance. When paleontologists later compared these fossils to ancient depictions of griffins, the similarities were striking. Imagine a Scythian trader coming across a partially exposed Protoceratops skeleton. The beak skull might suggest an eagle's head. The four-legged body could be interpreted as lion-like. The bony frill might even have seemed like folded wings. And crucially, these fossils were often found in gold-bearing regions, creating the association between griffins and gold that persisted in myth. Adrian Mayer, a folklorist and historian of science, developed this theory in the 1990s. She demonstrated how the anatomical features of Protoceratops align remarkably well with ancient descriptions and artistic representations of griffins. The location matched too, exactly where ancient writers placed these gold-guarding creatures. What we're seeing is an early form of paleontology, humans encountering evidence of creatures unlike anything in their experience and using their existing framework to make sense of what they found. Without microscopes and carbon dating, they created narratives that honored what their eyes were telling them. Today, as we carefully brush sand from fossilized bones and reconstruct the creatures of Earth's distant past, we're doing essentially what those ancient travelers did, piecing together stories from fragments. The difference is our scientific method, but the wonder remains the same. The griffin wasn't entirely mythical after all. It was a memory, preserved in sand and story, of creatures that walked our planet millions of years before humans existed to name them. And so, the next time you encounter a griffin in a medieval manuscript or ancient Greek pottery, remember that you're looking at more than just fantasy. You're seeing the echo of a real creature, filtered through human eyes that were trying their best to make sense of a mysterious world. Imagine sailing the Indian Ocean 8 centuries ago. The moon hangs low and heavy, casting silver pathways across midnight waters. Persian merchants, their vessels laden with spices and stories, whisper about shadows that sometimes pass overhead, vast winged silhouettes momentarily eclipsing stars and moonlight alike. In logbooks weathered by salt and time, sailors documented creatures they called rock birds of such immense proportion that, according to Marco Polo's accounts, they could seize an elephant in their talons and carry it high into the air, and drop it so that it is smashed to pieces, whereupon the bird swoops down on it and feeds upon it. Fantastical, surely, the stuff of overheated imaginations and empty wine vessels, except perhaps not entirely. These seafarers weren't simply spinning yarns to while away endless nights at sea. They were witnessing the lingering cultural memory of creatures that had actually existed not in their time, but close enough to remain in the stories passed between generations. The shadows that haunted their dreams weren't conjured from nothing, but rather from fragmentary truths warped by time and telling. Travel now to Madagascar, that strange evolutionary laboratory floating off Africa's eastern coast. Until approximately 1.0 years ago, mere eye blink in geological time, this island was home to the Aepyornis, more commonly known as the elephant bird. Standing nearly 10 feet tall and weighing half a ton, these feathered colossi were the heaviest birds ever to exist. Their eggs were things of mathematical impossibility, measuring over a foot long with a volume equal to 160 chicken eggs. Local Malagasy communities occasionally unearth these calcified wonders, each one big enough to feed a village, each one somehow containing the blueprint for wings that would never truly fly. When Arabs and Persians first encountered tales of these birds, or perhaps even witnessed the final few specimens before human hunting eliminated them, is it any wonder they carried these stories back across the waters? With each retelling, the birds grew larger, their capabilities more mythic. What was already extraordinary became legend, the unforgettable image of a bird that could blot out the moon. And while Madagascar's giants were meeting their end, another avian terror was commanding the skies 1,000 miles eastward in New Zealand. Haast's eagle didn't achieve the elephant bird's sheer mass, but what it lacked in weight, it made up for in lethal precision. With a wingspan approaching 10 feet and talons larger than a tiger's claws, this raptor evolved to hunt the giant moa birds that roamed New Zealand's forests. The Māori people called it Puakai, Old Glutton, and their oral histories tell of a predator that occasionally mistook children for prey. When scientists reconstructed this eagle's hunting capabilities, they found little reason to doubt these stories. Its talons could exert pressure exceeding 50 pounds per square inch, easily enough to pierce a human skull. Its wings were relatively short and broad, adapted not for soaring but for explosive acceleration through dense forest, the perfect ambush predator. These weren't myths turned real. They were realities turned mythic creatures so extraordinary that human memory couldn't contain them without spilling over into legend. Between Madagascar's egg layers with their dream-sized shells and New Zealand's hunters with their lamb-lifting talons, we find the biological foundation for the rock that terrified sailors. What's particularly haunting is how recently these creatures walked and soared among us. The last elephant birds likely disappeared around the same time Notre Dame Cathedral was being constructed in Paris. The final Haast's eagle probably hunted New Zealand's forests, while Genghis Khan was conquering Asia. These weren't dinosaurs from unimaginably distant epochs, they were our neighbors, separated from us by mere centuries rather than millions of years. So next time you read of the rock in Arabian Nights or other ancient texts, remember, the more extraordinary the myth, the more likely it contains a kernel of truth, preserved like an insect in amber, waiting for us to recognize it. In the quiet dunes of Madagascar, enormous eggshells still emerge after heavy rains. In New Zealand's mountain valleys, the memory of sudden death from above lingers in stories told around fires. Sometimes, the line between myth and reality isn't drawn in stone, but sketched in feathers large enough to cast shadows across both moonlit waters and human imagination alike. In the half-light of dusk, when the Caribbean waters blend indigo with amber, sailors of centuries past would sometimes fall silent at the railings of their weathered ships. There, in that liminal space between wakefulness and dreams, they'd swear they witnessed something miraculous. The graceful silhouettes of mermaids gliding alongside their vessels. These weren't the sharp-toothed sirens of darker myths, but languid, curious creatures that seemed to watch the ships with ancient eyes before slipping back beneath the silver-dappled waves. Columbus himself recorded such sightings in 1493, noting in his journal what he believed were 3 mermaids rising from the sea. They were not as beautiful as they are painted, he wrote, disappointment evident in his careful script. What Columbus and countless mariners before and after him had encountered were neither fish nor human, but something perhaps more wondrous in its reality. Manatees and their oceanic cousins, dugongs, collectively known as Sirenians, after the very myths they inspired. These gentle giants drift through tropical shallows like living memories of a time when the boundary between natural and supernatural remained gloriously blurred. Their bodies, salt-soft and rounded, move with an unhurried grace that seems almost deliberate in its slowness. Watch them for long enough, and you might detect something like contentment in their measured movements, as they graze through underwater meadows of seagrass that sway like fields of wheat beneath coastal currents. Approaching 10 feet in length and weighing up to 1,000 pounds, these creatures nonetheless possess a delicacy that belies their size. Their skin, not scaled as a fish, but leathery and often mottled with the patina of age and oceanic journeys, catches sunlight filtering through shallow waters, creating that shimmer sailors once mistook for the gleam of mythical beauty. When they surface to breathe, it's with a soft exhalation that releases a misty plume into the air, a sighing breath that, carried across still waters at twilight, might indeed sound like the distant call of something not quite of this world. Perhaps it was the surprising familiarity of their faces that most captured the imagination of those early voyagers. Their countenance holds a peculiar wisdom, wide-set eyes that seem to regard the world with gentle curiosity, and a mouth that, in certain angles of fading light, might curve into what appears to be the ghost of a smile. Unforgettable to anyone who witnesses it is the tender way mothers nurse their calves, holding them close with flippers that, in shadow play against a setting sun, might cast silhouettes reminiscent of human arms embracing a child. These flippers tell an evolutionary tale as remarkable as any myth. Within their paddle-like form lie the hidden architecture of 5 fingers, the same structure found in human hands, in bat wings, in the paws of cats. These are the remnants of shared ancestry with land mammals, for the Sirenians once walked upon terra firma some 50 million years ago, before returning to the embrace of the sea. Unlike their distant cousins, the whales, they never ventured into the deep, instead finding their perfect niche in coastal shallows where seagrass grows in abundance. There's something hypnotic about watching manatees breathe. Unlike most mammals who breathe reflexively, these creatures consciously control each inhalation. They rise to the surface every few minutes in a rhythm almost tidal in its predictability. A slow ascent, a quiet breaking of the water's surface, the soft sound of exhalation followed by the drawing in of new breath. Then a gentle submersion once more. This lullaby cadence of their breathing has its own soporific effect on those who observe them for any length of time. The dugong, the manatee's oceanic relative found in Indo-Pacific waters, carries an additional touch of the mythical, a tale that splits into flukes reminiscent of the classic mermaid's tale depicted in maritime folklore across cultures. Both creatures move through their watery domains with a tranquility that seems almost meditative, undulating their bodies in vertical waves rather than the side-to-side motion of fish. In the drowsy warmth of equatorial evenings, when the boundary between sea and sky dissolves into watercolor hues, it requires little imagination to understand how sailors, weeks at sea, minds softened by isolation and yearning, might transform these gentle herbivores into the half-human sirens of legend. There is something undeniably magical in the way manatees and dugongs seem to exist outside time, moving through our modern oceans as living connections to an ancient past when the world still held mysteries in every unexplored cove and shadowed inlet. As dusk settles over the Ituri rainforest in the Belgian Congo, the jungle transforms into a realm of whispers. It was here, in the late 1800s, that European missionaries first heard tales that seemed spun from dreams rather than reality. Local hunters spoke of a strange creature they called ORP, a forest phantom that moved like liquid shadow between mahogany trunks, vanishing before one could truly comprehend what they had glimpsed. The descriptions defied classification, part donkey, part giraffe, with legs striped like a zebra yet a body glossed chestnut brown. The creature reportedly stood tall enough to browse among low branches, but possessed the nimble stealth of forest deer. Such contradictions led many to dismiss these accounts as mere folklore, another case of tropical imagination intensified by jungle heat and isolation. Henry Morton Stanley, the famed explorer, mentioned the animal in his journals as early as 1890, but his descriptions were treated as curiosities rather than scientific observations. After all, how could such a large mammal remain undiscovered? The Congo Basin, despite its vastness, had been traversed by enough naturalists that surely something so distinctive would have been properly documented by then. Yet the stories persisted, filtering through to Sir Harry Johnston, British governor of Uganda, who developed an almost obsessive fascination with the creature. During diplomatic missions, over evening meals illuminated by oil lamps, he would carefully extract details from local leaders, building a composite image of this impossible animal that seemed to exist simultaneously in multiple taxonomic categories. The Royal Zoological Society's Grand Hall in London became the stage for increasingly heated debates as the century turned. Members gathered beneath ornate ceilings, skepticism hanging as thick as pipe smoke in the candlelit air. Some of the most respected names in natural science found themselves divided over fragments of evidence, partial skins with peculiar markings, distinctive hoofprints cast in plaster, and second-hand accounts from traders who ventured deep into territories where conventional maps faded into conjecture. Sir Edwin Ray Lancaster, director of the British Museum of Natural History, stood before his colleagues in December of 1900, holding what appeared to be a striped piece of hide, unlike any known to Western science. The room fell silent as he announced, "Gentlemen, we are confronted with what may be the most significant zoological discovery of our time, or the most elaborate hoax." The society dispatched expeditions at considerable expense. Their equipment lists, including not only the standard collecting materials, but also specialized photography equipment to capture what many believed was merely a chimera born of Congo mythology. Letters between field researchers and London headquarters reveal a growing frustration as weeks turn to months with only fleeting traces, broken foliage, distinctive droppings, and the occasional track disappearing into impenetrable understory. It wasn't until 1901 that Sir Johnston finally secured incontrovertible evidence, a complete skin and 2 skulls, proving that this African unicorn was indeed real. The taxonomist named it Okopia johnstoni, acknowledging both its local name and the man who had persisted when others abandoned the search. The revelation sent ripples through scientific communities, a humbling reminder that the age of discovery had not yet yielded all its wonders. Today, camera traps positioned throughout the Okapi Wildlife Reserve capture what human eyes rarely witness, the ghost-like movements of this living relic. Modern footage reveals an animal of extraordinary contradiction. Massive, yet delicate, boldly patterned, yet nearly invisible, a creature of such shy, velvety silence that each careful step seems a meditation on concealment. Infrared sensors trigger as an okapi emerges from dense foliage, its coat absorbing moonlight rather than reflecting it. The animal pauses, listening with radar dish ears that rotate independently, capturing sounds beyond human perception. Its tongue, impossibly long and prehensile, reaches nearly 18 inches to select precise leaves with the delicacy of a botanical surgeon. Zoologists studying these recordings note how the okapi's striped legs break up its silhouette against dappled forest light, nature's camouflage so effective that even in our age of technological omniscience, many cameras record only empty frames, where sensors indicated movement seconds before. The animal's natural behavior reveals an evolutionary strategy shaped by millions of years of perfecting the art of remaining unseen. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the okapi is not merely its existence, but how thoroughly it reminds us of science's humility. This living connection to prehistoric giraffids survived into the modern era, not through aggression or abundance, but through the quiet persistence of remaining just beyond observation, a creature so perfectly adapted to evasion that an entire Western scientific establishment failed to confirm its existence until the 20th century had already begun. Picture yourself in a dense African forest, sometime in the mid-1800s. European explorers huddle around campfires as night descends, their faces illuminated by flickering flames. The darkness beyond their small circle of light seems alive with sounds, rustling leaves, distant calls, and something else, something that makes their skin prickle. A deep, resonant drumming that isn't quite a drum. It's the sound of massive palms striking equally massive chests, echoing through the trees like thunder contained within the forest canopy. These explorers, men who considered themselves the epitome of modern scientific thinking, would return to their homelands with tales that sounded suspiciously like the folk stories their grandmothers had told them. Stories of enormous, hairy beings that walked almost like men, possessed incredible strength, and lived in the shadows of mountains and deep forests. In the firelight, with that rhythmic chest beating penetrating the darkness around them, ancient fears resurfaced, and the line between scientific expedition and mythological encounter blurred considerably. Back in Europe, pamphlets and broadsheets circulated with crude woodcut illustrations depicting what we would now recognize as gorillas, but rendered as monstrous ogres with exaggerated fangs and malevolent expressions. These hill shadow giants, as some accounts called them, were said to kidnap unwary wanderers who ventured too far from established paths. One particularly popular pamphlet from 1847 described them as devils in the form of men, covered in black hair, with the strength of 10 laborers and a temperament most foul. How fascinating that creatures who would eventually be revealed as largely peaceful, family-oriented beings could inspire such terror. But the misunderstanding went both ways. Imagine being a gorilla, your species having lived relatively undisturbed for millennia, suddenly confronted with strange, pale creatures carrying thundersticks that could kill from a distance. The mutual incomprehension created a perfect environment for mythology to flourish, where science had yet to firmly establish itself. The stories weren't entirely European inventions, of course. Local folklore in regions where gorillas lived had long acknowledged their presence, though with considerably more accuracy and respect. Many Central African traditions understood these beings as distant cousins rather than monsters, powerful forest guardians who should be given wide berth but who weren't inherently malevolent. Some traditions even recognized familial structures within gorilla groups that paralleled human social arrangements. It's worth pausing to consider how these misunderstood creatures influenced European folklore retroactively. Once explorers encountered actual gorillas, they began to wonder if legends of trolls and wild men that had persisted for centuries might have originated from ancient encounters with similar primates. Perhaps the trolls of Scandinavian folklore, who turned to stone in sunlight, were simply nocturnal creatures who retreated to mountain caves during daylight hours. The human mind, after all, excels at transforming the unfamiliar into the monstrous. The true nature of these magnificent creatures wouldn't begin to be widely understood until the groundbreaking work of researchers like Jane Goodall in the mid-20th century. Where once fearful explorers had seen only threat and bestial behavior, Goodall's patient observations revealed deeply complex social structures and behaviors. What might have seemed like aggressive chest beating to terrified 19th century explorers was recontextualized as communication, a gorilla's way of establishing presence and position within their community. Particularly moving were Goodall's daybreak observations, which transformed what might once have been described as monsters stirring from their lairs into something far more recognizable: a family breakfast in the morning mist. Imagine the scene as she described it, the soft light of dawn filtering through the canopy, juvenile gorillas playfully tumbling while adults methodically gathered the day's first meal. The silverback patriarch keeping watchful eyes on his family, not as the ogre of European imagination, but as a protective father figure ensuring his family's safety as they began their day. This profound shift in perception reminds us how quickly monsters can become simply misunderstood relatives when we approach them with patience and scientific curiosity rather than fear. The hill shadow giants that once populated nightmare tales became in time endangered cousins deserving of our protection rather than our terror. As you drift towards sleep, consider how many other monsters throughout history might simply have been misunderstood beings, caught in the unfortunate circumstance of being different in a world that fears difference. The line between mythical creature and biological reality has always been thinner than we might care to admit. Sometimes, the monsters of our imagination have been walking beside us all along, waiting only for us to recognize their true nature. Imagine the scene. A small Slovenian village nestled against limestone cliffs sometime in the 16th century. Heavy rains have fallen for days, and the underground rivers that honeycomb the karst region have swollen, pushing upward through hidden channels. As the floodwaters finally recede, villagers venture out to assess the damage. Among the debris washed from the mountain's dark interior, they find something extraordinary: pale, serpentine creatures, their skin almost translucent, their eyes seemingly absent. "Dragon young," the villagers whisper, carefully collecting these strange beings. They're convinced these delicate, finger-length animals are the offspring of a much larger beast dwelling in the mountain depths. Local folklore had long told of massive dragons sleeping within the mountains, their fiery breath creating the hot springs, their movements causing earthquakes. These tiny, helpless creatures, surely they must be the children of such magnificent beasts, washed from their nursery chambers by the unrelenting floods. What made these beliefs so persistent wasn't just superstition, but something genuinely uncanny about these creatures. The villagers noted how they would sometimes emit a faint, ghostly glow in the darkness, further evidence of their draconic heritage. They handled them with a mixture of reverence and fear, returning some to the cave entrances as offerings to appease the parent dragons, keeping others as talismans or curiosities. For centuries, these pale baby dragons remained a mysterious part of Slovenian folklore, their true nature obscured by the inaccessible darkness from which they emerged. The glowing dragon young of Slovenian legend eventually found their way into scientific classification as Proteus anguinus, a name that does little justice to centuries of mythological significance. While modern biology has dispensed with notions of dragon parentage, the Olm's reality is perhaps even more fascinating than the legends. That mysterious glow reported by medieval villagers. Not entirely imaginary. Under certain light conditions, their pale skin can indeed reflect light in eerily luminescent ways, and some Olms develop a subtle pigmentation that appears faintly bluish in darkness. But unlike the fire-breathing beasts of myth, the Olm's most remarkable feature is its astonishing metabolic patience. These creatures exist in a state of perpetual, unhurried tranquility. Their hearts beat just twice per minute. When at rest, imagine waiting 30 seconds between each heartbeat. They breathe perhaps once every 10 minutes. This glacial metabolism allows them to survive without food for extraordinary periods. Laboratory specimens have lived without eating for up to 10 years. While dragons in stories hoard gold and devour knights, the Olm simply waits, suspended in cool darkness, barely disturbing the water around it. They are evolution's response to a very specific question: how to survive in perfect darkness, where food arrives only sporadically, carried on unpredictable floods. The answer: slow down everything. Move less, need less, wait longer. The Olm isn't racing toward any evolutionary goal. It has found its perfect niche and settled into a pace of life measured not in frantic days but in gentle decades, sometimes living beyond a century, breeding perhaps once every 12 years. Peer closer at an Olm in its watery habitat, and you'll notice something otherworldly about its anatomy, something that might indeed remind you of mythical creatures. Behind its small flat head flutter delicate external gills, crimson feathers waving gently in the current like the ornate frills of some aquatic dragon. These are not merely decorative, they're sophisticated respiratory organs, extracting oxygen directly from the water with remarkable efficiency. In the perfect stillness of cave pools, these feathery appendages create the Olm's only perceptible movement, a subtle, rhythmic pulsing that might be mistaken for breathing but is actually the beating of blood vessels within the gill structure. The rest of their anatomy speaks to eons of adaptation to lightless existence. Their eyes begin developing normally in the embryonic stage but are then covered by skin as they mature, vestigial windows to a world of light they'll never experience. Instead, they navigate through an impressive array of alternative senses. Their skin contains cells sensitive to both light and electrical fields. Their heads house specialized mechanoreceptors that can detect the slightest water movements, perhaps a tiny crustacean passing nearby, or the distant vibration of an approaching storm sending water through new channels. Most remarkably, they possess an organ utterly foreign to human experience: ampullary organs that detect the electrical fields generated by all living things, allowing them to hunt in perfect darkness. In the absolute black of their subterranean realm, olms create a complete picture of their surroundings without ever seeing them, sensing the silent electrical whispers of life forms around them, feeling the caress of unseen currents, tasting the mineral composition of the waters with extraordinary precision. Imagine, if you will, the vast stretches of ancient American plains. The tall grasses bend in waves beneath gathering storm clouds as distant thunder rolls across the darkening sky. But what if that thunder wasn't just the collision of air masses? What if some of those rolling booms were the wing beats of birds so massive they blotted out the sun? For countless generations, indigenous peoples across North and South America spoke of the thunderbird, a creature of immense power, whose wings brought storms and whose eyes flashed lightning. When settlers first heard these tales, they dismissed them as mere mythology, the product of primitive minds seeking to explain natural phenomena. How convenient to relegate what we don't understand to the realm of fantasy. But as we so often discover in the borderlands between myth and natural history, there was perhaps more truth to these stories than anyone realized. Beneath the layers of folklore lay the shadows of memories, collective remembrances of actual creatures that once darkened prehistoric skies. The great Argentavis magnificens soared above the Andean foothills some 6 million years ago. Its wingspan stretched nearly 24 feet from tip to tip, roughly the width of a small passenger plane. Try to picture this for a moment as you drift towards sleep. A bird with wings broader than your bedroom ceiling, gliding silently on thermal currents high above ancient landscapes. When paleontologists first assembled the fossilized remains of Argentavis, they had to lay them out across classroom floors to comprehend the scale. Feather by imagined feather, bone by hollow bone, the creature emerged from the dust of millennia. Its massive shoulder joints and reinforced wing bones told a story of evolutionary adaptation to a life spent mostly aloft, conserving energy by soaring rather than flapping. Further north, across the plains of what would become the United States, the slightly smaller but no less impressive Teratornis meriami ruled the skies about 12,000 years ago. With wingspans approaching 12 feet, these birds would have cast moving shadows across the landscape as they hunted. Their presence lasted just long enough to potentially overlap with the earliest human inhabitants of the Americas. Think about that timeline for a moment. The first peoples to cross into the Americas may have witnessed these living relics of an earlier age. They would have seen with their own eyes what we can only reconstruct through bone fragments and scientific inference. Is it any wonder these birds left such an impression that they soared into mythology? The timing matters here. When we examine the dates of the most recent Teratornis fossils and compare them with the earliest evidence of human habitation, we find an intriguing overlap. It's entirely possible, even probable, that the oral traditions of thunderbirds began not as pure invention but as actual observation, passed down through countless generations, the details shifting and taking on spiritual significance with each retelling. Indigenous elders speak of the thunderbird with reverence, describing how the beating of its enormous wings created the sound of thunder and how lightning flashed from its eyes when it blinked. The Sioux, Ojibwe, Algonquian, and dozens of other nations all have their variations of the thunderbird story, yet the core elements remain remarkably consistent across thousands of miles and numerous distinct cultures. Some traditional stories describe how thunderbirds nested on mountain peaks, from where they could survey vast territories. Others tell of how these sacred beings brought rain to parched lands, maintaining the balance of nature. The similarities between these accounts and what we now know about the hunting and nesting behaviors of large scavenging birds are striking. When early anthropologists first documented these stories, they categorized them as quaint attempts to explain natural phenomena, thunder, lightning, and rain. But perhaps we should consider another interpretation, that these were attempts to preserve the memory of real creatures, incorporated into spiritual frameworks to ensure their stories would endure through generations. Imagine the final days of the last Teratornis, as changing climates and shifting ecosystems brought their long reign to a close. Picture the elders of ancient human communities, pointing to the sky as one of these massive birds circled overhead, telling children to remember this sight, to tell their own children of what they had witnessed. As the birds became rarer, sightings would become special events, worthy of celebration and ceremony. And so the Thunderbird transitioned from physical reality to cultural memory, from natural history to sacred story. The booming wing beats became lullabies told by firelight. The massive shadows on the prairie transformed into protectors, watching over the people from the spirit world. In this way, the Thunderbird reminds us that myths often contain kernels of truth, preserved like insects in amber across the vast expanses of time. As you drift towards sleep, consider how many other legendary creatures might have similar origins. Real animals witnessed by our ancestors, their memories kept alive through stories that comfort and connect us to a world long past. Imagine, if you will, a moonless night along the ancient Nile. The water appears as black as obsidian, save for the countless stars that scatter their silvery reflections across its surface like fallen jewels. You're in a slender papyrus boat, your guide pushing you forward with a long wooden pole that disappears into the unfathomable depths below. The darkness is almost complete, wrapped around you like a burial shroud, when suddenly you see them. Pairs of glowing amber orbs hovering just above the water's surface. Crocodile eyes, watching, waiting, calculating. But they aren't what the ancient Egyptians truly feared in these waters. The real terror came from something far more massive. Something that could emerge from beneath the inky waters with almost no warning. A behemoth that could snap a boat in half as easily as you might break a twig. The Egyptians called it river horse, or as we know it today, the hippopotamus. These weren't merely animals to the ancient Egyptians. They were manifestations of chaos itself, demons of the river that served as emissaries of Set, god of disorder and violence. Crossing the Nile at night was considered an act of either tremendous courage or profound foolishness. Fishermen who ventured out under starlight would whisper protective incantations, their voices barely audible above the gentle lapping of water against their vessels. They knew that somewhere in that darkness lurked creatures that could rise from the depths with jaws agape, capable of crushing a human with disturbing ease. The hippo didn't need to stalk or hunt, it simply needed to be annoyed by your presence, and your fate would be sealed beneath those crushing teeth. The ancient Egyptians developed an intricate relationship with these river monsters. In the mystical libraries of temple priests and the scroll collections of court magicians, one could find elaborate spells specifically designed to ward off the hippo demons that ruled the Nile after sunset. These weren't simple prayers, but complex rituals that sometimes lasted hours and required specific ingredients. Chief among these protective elements were, paradoxically, parts of the very creature they feared, hippopotamus tusks. Carved amulets fashioned from hippo ivory were among the most powerful protective charms in ancient Egyptian magic. Spell scrolls from the Book of the Dead describe how wearing such an amulet could turn the wearer invisible to the eyes of river demons. Other spells required the practitioner to recite lengthy incantations while holding a hippo tusk dipped in special oils, the words believed to bind the demons to the depths of the river until sunrise. Temple walls at Komombo and Edfu preserve hieroglyphic records of these spells, alongside images of priests subduing hippo demons with magical implements. In one particularly vivid depiction, a priest holds aloft a staff topped with a hippo tusk while reciting from a scroll, as shadowy hippo figures retreat into swirling waters below. The Egyptians believed that by possessing part of the creature, they could command power over its whole being, a magical principle that appears across countless ancient cultures. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this relationship was its duality. While feared as demons, hippos were simultaneously associated with Taweret, a protective goddess of childbirth and fertility, depicted as a pregnant hippopotamus standing upright. This goddess, with her fearsome hippo head, lion's paws, and crocodile tail, represented the protective, nurturing aspects of the same creature that was elsewhere demonized as an agent of chaos. What makes this mythology particularly intriguing is the stark contrast between the fearsome reputation of the hippopotamus and its actual ecological role. Despite their portrayal as water demons, hippos are primarily gentle grazers. These enormous creatures, weighing up to 3 tons, subsist almost entirely on grass. Each night, they emerge from the water to wander several miles inland, consuming up to 80 pounds of vegetation before returning to the cool sanctuary of the river by dawn. Their infamous yawn, that terrifying display of ivory tusks and pink maw, can open wider than a crocodile's bite, reaching an impressive 150 degrees. Yet this dramatic gesture isn't primarily an aggressive display, but rather a complex social signal that serves multiple purposes in hippo communities. It's a warning, yes, but also a greeting, a territorial marker, and occasionally even a stress response. In the water, hippos don't actually swim. Their massive bodies are too dense. Instead, they push themselves off river bottoms and float up for air before sinking back down, a peculiar form of aquatic movement that ancient Egyptians interpreted as supernatural, further cementing the creature's otherworldly status. They appear to glide effortlessly through water despite their enormous bulk, moving with a grace that seems impossible for creatures of their size. The hippopotamus exists in that strange borderland between myth and reality, a creature so outlandish in its proportions and capabilities that it scarcely seems possible. Yet there it stands, not a demon but a remarkable evolutionary success story, having changed little in form over millions of years. Perhaps in this way, the ancient Egyptians weren't entirely wrong to view them with a mixture of terror and reverence. The river horse remains one of nature's most impressive monuments, a living fossil that continues to inspire awe just as it did along the moonlit waters of the ancient Nile. In the highest passes of the Himalayas, where the air grows thin and the world falls away beneath clouds that cling to jagged peaks like tattered prayer flags, there exists a whisper. The locals know it well, a sound that travels through generations rather than merely across valleys. They speak of massive footprints appearing overnight in virgin snow, of livestock taken under cover of blizzards, of glimpses through swirling white of something large, something upright, something that shouldn't be there. The wind carries strange sounds across these snow-smothered passes, distant, rhythmic crunching footfalls that echo between mountain faces. Too heavy for a snow leopard, too deliberate for a landslide, too persistent for imagination alone. For centuries, the Sherpa people have named this presence Yeti, the wild man of the snow. A creature that walks the boundary between our world and something older, a remnant perhaps of when the mountains themselves were young. Western explorers dismissed these stories as folklore born of isolation and extreme conditions. After all, the human mind seeks patterns in chaos, faces in rock faces, meaning in random sounds, and yet, those who have spent long enough in these mountains, who have felt the weight of solitude pressing down as heavily as the snow, they sometimes return with stories they're reluctant to share in the harsh light of academia. What makes the Yeti legend persist is not merely its mystique, but the curious fact that science has slowly, reluctantly begun to provide fragments of evidence that suggest the impossible. Perhaps something did walk these mountains once, something that left more than just footprints in folklore. In the 1930s, anthropologists made a curious discovery in Chinese apothecary shops: massive fossilized jawbones, the size of soup bowls, labeled as dragon teeth in traditional medicine. When these specimens finally reached proper scientific examination, they revealed something extraordinary: the remains of a colossal primate that once roamed the forests of Southeast Asia. Gigantopithecus, blackia creature that stood nearly 10 feet tall when upright, weighing over 1,000 pounds, with powerful jaws that could crush bamboo and nuts with ease. The largest ape to ever walk the earth didn't leave much behind, just fragments of jawbones and teeth, preserved in limestone caves scattered across southern China and Vietnam. No complete skeleton has ever been found. No frozen specimens preserved in ice. Just enough to confirm its existence and approximate its staggering size, while leaving almost everything else about it to scientific inference and imagination. What we do know is that Gigantopithecus shared the landscape with our early human ancestors. For hundreds of thousands of years, early humans would have encountered these gentle vegetarian giants, perhaps watching from a respectful distance as they moved through bamboo forests with deliberate, heavy steps. The creatures vanished only about 100 years ago, a geological blink of an eye, recent enough that their memory could conceivably have been carried in oral traditions across generations. Is it possible that the Yeti legend represents cultural memory of an actual creature, preserved in stories that crossed mountains and millennia alike? Perhaps. But there's another, more complex possibility that has emerged from recent scientific advances. DNA analysis of alleged Yeti specimens, hair samples, bone fragments, and tissue collected from monasteries and museums across the Himalayas revealed a curious genetic signature, not of some unknown primate, but primarily of an unusual subspecies of Himalayan brown bear, with occasional samples from other regional wildlife. These bears, adapted to high-altitude living, sometimes walk upright on their hind legs when traversing steep slopes or surveying their surroundings, leaving behind curious tracks that appear almost human-like, especially when partially melted and refrozen. Yet this doesn't entirely dismiss the legend. Rather, it weaves a more complex tapestry where DNA traces thread together legend, bear, and possibly the memory of extinct apes into one soft snowdrift of possibility. Cultural anthropologists suggest that legends often contain multiple layers of truth observations of real animals, blended with memories of creatures long vanished, all wrapped in the necessary adaptations that allow stories to survive their journey through generations. When night falls in the Himalayas and temperatures plummet, when the wind moves through narrow passes, creating sounds that might be footfalls or might be nothing at all, the boundary between what is and what might once have been grows thin. Perhaps someday we'll find more conclusive evidence of what exactly haunts these mountains, be it bear, cultural memory, or something else entirely. Until then, the Yeti remains exactly what its footprints suggest. A creature that walks the borderland between science and story, between evidence and imagination, leaving just enough of a trace to make us wonder what else might be waiting to be discovered in the white silence of the highest places on Earth. Imagine a mirror-flat dawn, the kind that makes the horizon disappear. The ocean surface so still it becomes a perfect reflection of the pale morning sky, and then a ripple. Not from above, but from below. The glassy surface parts, and something impossible emerges, a living silver ribbon, 20 meters of shimmering scales undulating vertically through the water column. A crown of scarlet plumage adorns its tiny head, its eyes enormous and black against the metallic sheen of its impossibly long body. The creature hovers there, suspended between worlds, a visitor from the deep that seems more apparition than animal. This is the oarfish, known to science as Regalicus glesne, a being so strange that for centuries it was dismissed as mere fantasy. You might wonder how something so massive could remain hidden from human knowledge for so long. The answer lies in its natural habitat. The oarfish dwells in the mesopelagic twilight zone, between 200 and 1,000 meters beneath the surface, where sunlight barely penetrates. They only venture upward when dying or distressed, meaning that for most of human history, our only glimpse of these creatures came from those that washed ashore, their bodies already twisted and decaying, looking even more monstrous in death than they did in life. The fishermen who first encountered these beings had no scientific framework to understand what they were seeing. How could they? When you've spent your life pulling familiar creatures from the sea, the cod, the herring, the occasional shark, and suddenly before you lies something that resembles a dragon more than a fish, what conclusions would you draw? And so began the weaving of tales, stories passed from boat to boat, port to port, generation to generation. Norwegian fishermen spoke of the havguva, a sea serpent that would rise from the depths to herald storms. Icelandic sailors told of encounters with the havgufa, a beast so large it was mistaken for an island. All across the North Atlantic, stories accumulated like barnacles on an old hull. The most famous of these mythological cousins to the oarfish is Jörmungandr, the Midgard serpent of Norse mythology. This immense beast was said to encircle the entire world, grasping its own tail in its mouth. So enormous was this creature that when it finally released its tail during Ragnarok, the Norse apocalypse, the resulting thrashing would cause tsunamis capable of drowning the world. The similarities are striking. Like the oarfish, Jörmungandr dwelled in the deepest parts of the ocean. Like the oarfish, it was described as impossibly long, a living ribbon that seemed to have no end. And like sightings of the oarfish, encounters with Jörmungandr were rare and often presaged disaster. It's easy to imagine how a storm-addled sailor, glimpsing a 17-meter oarfish rising vertically through churning waters, might believe they'd seen the edge of a creature large enough to encircle the earth. In the semi-darkness before dawn or after dusk, with the sea heaving beneath a wooden vessel that suddenly seems terribly fragile, such a sight would burn itself into memory and mythology alike. But the reality of the oarfish is gentler than these fearsome legends suggest. Despite their serpentine appearance and intimidating size, they are peaceful filter feeders, drifting through the darkness and consuming tiny crustaceans, small fish, and jellyfish. Their bodies are adapted not for hunting large prey or battling gods, but for efficiency in the open ocean. The distinctive red crest, which no doubt contributed to their dragon-like appearance in seafarer tales, serves as a sensory array, helping them navigate their darkened realm. Their musculature tells the story of a creature that never willingly breaks the surface. Unlike the powerful, sinuous bodies of true sea serpents from myth, the oarfish's form is relatively delicate. They lack the strong swimming muscles that would allow them to battle against currents or pursue prey. Instead, they move by undulating their dorsal fin in a wave-like motion, a mesmerizing ripple that propels them gently through the water column. This is not the movement of a predator, but of a floating ribbon caught in an unseen breeze. When oarfish do appear at the surface, it is almost always because they are dying or disoriented. Some researchers believe they may be affected by seismic activity or changes in underwater currents that push them upward from their preferred depths. Others suggest that parasitic infections or illness may disrupt their equilibrium. Whatever the cause, their appearance in shallow waters is a death sentence. Their bodies simply aren't built to withstand the differing pressures and temperatures of the surface world. Perhaps there is a peculiar poignancy in this. The creatures that gave rise to some of humanity's most enduring legends of sea monsters come to us only in their most vulnerable moments, adrift and dying in a realm for which they were never designed. The fearsome Jormungandr of myth is, in reality, a gentle giant, lost and confused when we encounter it, its legendary status the product not of malice but of misunderstanding. Picture yourself walking across the hardened asphalt of Rancho La Brea, that ancient tar pit that has preserved so many secrets of a world long past. The sky above is darkening to indigo, and somewhere in the distance, if you listen carefully, you might hear the whispers of creatures that no longer walk our earth. Among those whispers are the low growls of Canis dirus, the dire wolf, whose massive jaws once closed around the throats of ancient prey beneath these same stars. The La Brea tar pits have yielded over 4,000 dire wolf specimens, more than any other predator trapped in those sticky, preserving depths. They tell us a story of a creature both familiar and strange, larger than our modern wolves, with jaws that could crush bone with ease, and teeth designed to tear through the thickest hides of Pleistocene megafauna. Think of them moving in the moonlight, their shoulders higher, their heads broader than the wolves we know today. Their paw prints would have sunk deeper into the soft earth as they tracked their prey through ancient woodlands and across vast grasslands that no longer exist. The dire wolf wasn't just slightly bigger than our modern grey wolf. It was built differently, evolved for a world of giant sloths and mammoths. Its skull housed powerful muscles that anchored to a distinctive crest running along the top, giving it a bite force that would make even today's strongest predators seem gentle by comparison. As you drift towards sleep, imagine those jaws closing around the leg of a young horse or the shoulder of a bison, not out of malice, but out of the simple, ancient necessity of survival. The moon rises higher now, both in our imagination and in the stories of medieval Europe, where another kind of wolf was feared, one that walked as a man except when the full moon called forth its hidden nature. The werewolf, that most persistent of European monsters, grew from kernels of truth wrapped in layers of fear. In the darkness of medieval forests, real wolves did howl. Real wolves did sometimes attack livestock and, in dire times of famine or rabies, even humans. But the imagination needs more than simple predators. It needs monsters that mirror our own hidden natures. In the drowsy candlelight of medieval villages, stories spread of men who transformed unwillingly when the sorrowful moon grew full. The medieval mind saw such transformations as curses or punishments, signs of sin or dealings with darkness. The French called them loup-garou, the Germans werewolf, the Norse varulfa, each culture building its own variation of the human-wolf hybrid that embodied their deepest fears of wildness and loss of control. Some were said to transform by donning wolf pelts, others through dark magic or divine punishment. Tales told of trials where accused werewolves were examined for marks or tested by cutting their suspected wolf forms, hoping to find the same wound on their human bodies once transformed back. The connection between wolves and the moon grew stronger with each retelling until it became the fixed tradition we know today, that the full moon's silver light draws forth the beast from within the man. As your eyelids grow heavy, let's slow our journey through time even further, settling into the rhythm of Pleistocene ecology, where dire wolves didn't transform but instead evolved over countless generations. Their pack bonds would have resembled those of modern wolves, complex social structures built on cooperation and communication. They would have raised their pups in dens, regurgitated food for their young, and coordinated their hunts with a sophistication that allowed them to take down prey much larger than any individual wolf could manage alone. Yet for all their adaptations, for all their success across North and South America for over 1 million years, the dire wolves vanished around 13,000 years ago. While our own grey wolves managed to adapt to the changing world at the end of the last ice age, their larger cousins disappeared along with the megafauna they had evolved to hunt. Recent DNA studies suggest that, unlike grey wolves who interbred with other canid species, dire wolves were genetically isolated. They couldn't adapt through hybridization when their world began to change. There's something comforting in knowing that the bonds between pack members remained strong until the end, that the last dire wolves still hunted together, still shared food, still raised their young with the same care their ancestors had shown for 1 million years before them. As you drift towards sleep, imagine those final generations, moving through forests increasingly empty of the giant prey they relied upon, their ancient adaptations becoming less useful with each passing century, until finally, the last of them slipped away into the long night of extinction, leaving behind only bones to whisper their stories from the darkness of the tar. The dire wolf and the werewolf, one a creature of scientific fact, the other of human imagination, both speak to our complex relationship with the wild, with the darkness, and with the parts of ourselves that remember, somewhere deep in our DNA, what it was to fear the sound of howling in the night. Imagine, if you will, the vast steppes of Ice Age Eurasia, where temperatures plummet and winds howl across landscapes blanketed in endless white. In this realm of frost and survival, a creature roamed that would later fuel the imaginations of our ancestors for millennia to come. Not the delicate horse-like being of children's fantasies, but something far more formidable, the Coelodonta antiquitatis, or as we more casually know it, the woolly rhinoceros. This massive beast, with its shaggy coat and imposing silhouette, carried atop its snout not the spiraled horn of fairy tales, but something perhaps even more remarkable, a singular, forward-projecting horn that could reach over 3 feet in length, often glazed with a delicate lattice of frost crystals that caught the pale winter sun like a crown of diamonds. When we examine the remarkably preserved specimens pulled from the permafrost tombs of Siberia, what emerges is not merely an extinct species, but the ghostly ancestor of our unicorn myths. These permafrost silhouettes, frozen in time like nature's own taxidermy, reveal a creature both familiar and alien to our modern eyes. The horn, that magnificent solitary spear, was not bone as many assume, but rather densely packed keratin fibers, the same material as your fingernails, compressed into a formidable weapon that could tear through predator and foliage alike. When coated with the hoarfrost of ancient winters, these horns transformed into something almost magical, ice-tipped lances that glittered in the weak Arctic sun, sometimes accumulating frost crystals so thick they appeared to be carved from the very ice itself. Imagine early humans, huddled around fires against the bitter cold, watching these massive beasts lumber across the horizon, their singular horns catching the light like beacons in the snow-driven twilight. Is it any wonder they became the subjects of our earliest attempts at storytelling? Deep within the womb-like chambers of places like France's Chauvet Cave and Spain's Altamira, our ancestors pressed pigment to stone and brought these creatures to life. Under the dancing flames of tallow lamps, these ancient murals still flicker and seem to move, just as they did for their creators some 30 years ago. The woolly rhinoceros appears with surprising frequency, its distinctive profile unmistakable, that single horn emphasized with careful strokes of charcoal and ochre. Sometimes depicted in hunting scenes, sometimes in solitary majesty, these images traveled through time like messages in bottles, washing up on the shores of medieval Europe's consciousness. When these cave paintings were occasionally discovered by later peoples, shepherds seeking shelter, miners expanding tunnels, children playing where they shouldn't, the images they found helped shape the evolving mythology of the unicorn. Medieval bards, already working with fragmented tales of strange one-horned beasts from distant lands, found in these ancient artworks confirmation of their wildest stories. The unicorn of medieval tapestries and bestiaries may prance with equine grace rather than rhinoceros bulk, but the singular horn, the sense of ancient power, the association with purity and wildness, these elements can be traced back to those flickering cave walls and the real creature that inspired them. Yet, like all tales worth telling, this one carries its melancholy notes. The woolly rhinoceros, that Ice Age unicorn, met its end not with dramatic thunder but with the subtle shifting of the world's rhythms. As the great glaciers began their retreat roughly 14,000 years ago, the specialized ecosystem that sustained these massive browsers began to change. Grasslands gave way to forests, cold-adapted plants to temperate varieties. Some scientists suggest that as the permafrost melted, the soggy ground made it difficult for the heavy creatures to traverse their former domains. Others point to human hunters, whose increasing skills and numbers may have delivered the final blow to already struggling populations. However it happened, the decline of the woolly rhinoceros was like a candle quietly guttering out, a slow dimming rather than a sudden extinction. The last populations, isolated on the Siberian plains, gradually became more sparse, their numbers dwindling season by season, year by year, until the final ice-horn silhouette faded from the Earth stage altogether. In the geological blink of an eye, a creature that had survived and thrived for hundreds of thousands of years simply wasn't anymore. What remains are bones, the occasional miraculously preserved specimen, those ancient cave paintings, and the echoes of its influence in our unicorn legends. Perhaps there's something fitting about this, that a creature so magnificent would transcend its own extinction to gallop forever through our collective imagination, transformed but immortal, its ice-glazed horn now a spiral of magic rather than keratin, its heavy footfalls now the delicate prancing of a horse-like dream. Sleep now, and perhaps in your dreams you'll glimpse that ancient silhouette, the true unicorn of old, lumbering across the frost-crisp plains of a world long gone, its breath clouding in the cold, its solitary horn gleaming with ice crystals caught in the weak winter sun of prehistory. The billabongs of Australia lie silent under stars that seem impossibly close. Moonlight spills across the water's surface like liquid silver, catching on the rough bark of ancient eucalyptus trees that stand as patient sentinels around these sacred pools. If you were to sit beside one such billabong tonight, you might notice something peculiar, how the water sometimes shivers without any wind to disturb it. Small ripples appear from nowhere, concentric circles that expand outward before disappearing against the muddy banks. The Aboriginal elders will tell you to move away from the water's edge when darkness falls. They'll speak in hushed tones about what dwells beneath those still waters. The bunyip, a creature of dreamtime lore that has haunted the collective consciousness of Australia's first peoples for tens of thousands of years. They say it comes with the sound of rushing water, with eyes that glow like embers in the dark, and a cry that shakes the very earth beneath your feet. For generations, these stories were dismissed by European settlers as mere superstition, primitive fears born from isolation and ignorance. How convenient it was to dismiss the warnings of those who had lived alongside these waters since time immemorial. How simple to categorize their ancestral knowledge as fantasy when it didn't align with European understanding of the natural world. And yet, in the dry beds of ancient lakes, in the sun-bleached clay of the outback, paleontologists began uncovering something remarkable. Enormous bones, unlike anything seen in modern Australia. Ribs curved like ancient boats, skulls the size of small boulders, the fossilized remains of creatures that had once lumbered through primeval forests and wallowed in prehistoric swamps. The Diprotodon, largest of all marsupials that ever lived, stood taller than a man at the shoulder when on all fours, weighing up to 2.5 tons. Picture, if you will, a wombat grown to the size of a hippopotamus, with massive clawed feet that left impressions in the soft earth around waterholes. These gentle giants roamed the continent in herds, browsing on leaves and shrubs, their heavy bodies creating paths through dense vegetation that smaller creatures would follow. For at least 40 years, the Aboriginal peoples of Australia shared their land with these enormous beasts. They hunted them, feared them, respected them, and ultimately, they remembered them. Rock art from the Northern Territory depicts creatures of impossible size, with distinctive features that match no living animal but align perfectly with the reconstructed appearance of the Diprotodon. Stories passed down through countless generations speak of monsters that would emerge from watering holes at dusk, their bodies dripping with weed and mud, their presence heralded by strange disturbances in otherwise calm waters. Is it mere coincidence that the fearsome bunyip is said to dwell in the same billabongs where Diprotodon fossils are most commonly found? Or did the last of these magnificent creatures find refuge in the shrinking waterways as their world began to change around them? For change it did, with merciless certainty. Approximately 46 years ago, Australia began experiencing a profound shift in climate. The lush woodlands that had sustained megafauna for millions of years slowly gave way to more arid landscapes. Waterholes that had once been permanent features began to dry up seasonally. Food became scarce. And into this already precarious balance came a new predator, humans, with their controlled use of fire and sophisticated hunting strategies. One by one, the great beasts of Australia's prehistory vanished. The 3-ton wombats, the marsupial lions, the giant kangaroos that stood 3 meters tall. All gone, save for the stories told around campfires and the massive bones occasionally revealed by erosion or drought. The Diprotodon's final days must have been a gradual retreat to the last reliable water sources, the deep, spring-fed billabongs that never quite dried up, even in the harshest summers. These final individuals, perhaps the last of their kind, would have created quite an impression as they emerged from the water at dusk, their massive bodies dripping, their ancient eyes reflecting starlight. Is it any wonder that stories of water monsters persisted long after the actual creatures had disappeared from the landscape? Today, when the moon is full and the billabongs lie still under eucalyptus shadows, it's not difficult to imagine that something ancient still stirs in those murky depths. Perhaps it's just the collective memory of a time when giants walked alongside humans, a primitive echo of a world we have lost. Or perhaps, as some Aboriginal elders might suggest with a knowing smile, it's wiser not to linger too long beside still waters when darkness falls across the outback. Across the ancient prairies of North America, when night settled like a heavy blanket and distant storms rolled toward the horizon, something truly extraordinary would sometimes appear, silhouetted against the flashing sky. Imagine, if you will, the outline of what seems at first to be an ordinary large cat, until lightning strikes again, revealing twin curved daggers protruding from its mouth. These weren't demons or spirits conjured by the storm, but smilodons, what we commonly call saber-toothed tigers, though they weren't actually tigers at all. In those brief illuminated moments when thunder shook the plains, these creatures must have seemed like apparitions. Their most distinctive feature, those impressive canine teeth, could grow up to 11 inches long in the largest species. When backlit by lightning, these twin sabers would have gleamed like pale fire, creating an image that surely burned itself into the memory of any human fortunate, or perhaps unfortunate, enough to witness it. The prairie knights belonged to these predators. They moved with a muscular grace that belied their bulk, heavier and more powerfully built than modern lions, with particularly strong forelimbs. They weren't built for lengthy chases across open ground like modern cheetahs, instead preferring to ambush their prey, perhaps using the cover of those very storms to mask their approach. The thunder would hide their footfalls. The rain would disguise their scent, and the lightning would only reveal them at the final, terrifying moment of attack. These magnificent predators roamed North America until roughly 10,000 years ago, which means they absolutely encountered the earliest human inhabitants of these continents. Evidence suggests they may have survived even longer in some isolated pockets, perhaps lingering just long enough to enter the oral traditions of numerous indigenous cultures. Many Native American stories speak of spirit cats with unnaturally long teeth, mysterious guardians of ancestral pathways. The Lakota tell of the Manata, a giant cat with teeth like knives that would appear during electrical storms, while several southwestern tribes describe the Zamax, a golden cat with teeth like icicles that protected sacred mountain passes and would only allow those with pure intentions to travel safely. These weren't mere campfire tales to frighten children. They served as important cultural markers, geographical guideposts that helped navigate both physical and spiritual landscapes. The places where these spirit cats were said to dwell often aligned with known Smilodon fossil sites, suggesting a cultural memory preserved across countless generations. Ancient hunting parties may have stumbled upon exposed Smilodon remains, perhaps even complete skeletons with those unmistakable teeth still intact, creating an association between certain territories and these fearsome guardians. The trails where spirit cats were said to roam frequently followed natural migration routes, both for humans and for the megafauna that Smilodons would have hunted. In this way, the legends served a practical purpose, keeping travelers on safe, established paths, while warning them of territories where predators might still lurk. The spiritual aspect of these stories added weight to their practical warnings, ensuring they would be remembered and respected. Even today, some elders speak of dreaming of the tooth daggers, a sign that one has strayed from their proper path. The lightning fangs in these dreams are rarely threatening. More often they appear as gentle reminders to return to traditional ways, echoing how these magnificent creatures once helped guide ancient peoples across unfamiliar landscapes. Modern museum reconstructions of Smilodons present a somewhat different picture from these mythical accounts. Behind glass barriers, carefully assembled skeletons display those impressive canines in static poses, unable to capture how they might have looked when suddenly illuminated by prairie lightning. Diorama scenes show them hunting prehistoric bison or giant ground sloths, but cannot convey the spiritual significance they held for early Americans. Some exhibitions have attempted to recreate the sounds these creatures might have made, though of course, no human ever recorded a Smilodon's call. Scientists believe they likely couldn't roar like modern lions due to differences in throat anatomy, perhaps instead producing something closer to a loud purr. For our purposes tonight, let's imagine that sound, a deep, resonant rumble, somewhere between the comfort of a house cat's contentment and the warning vibration of an approaching storm. Close your eyes if you feel safe to do so, and picture this. A Smilodon mother with cubs, settled in the entrance of a shallow cave as rain begins to fall outside, her massive body curled protectively around her offspring, those famous teeth occasionally catching the light of distant lightning, while from her throat comes a sound designed by evolution to soothe her young, a kitten-soft purr, but amplified through the powerful chest of a creature that could bring down a bison, a gentle thunder all its own, calling you deeper into dreams of ancient prairies and storm-lit predators with lightning in their fangs. Imagine, if you will, the quiet Oxfordshire countryside in the 1820s. The soft chalk quarries of Stonesfield had been yielding curious objects for decades: strange stones, ancient shells, and occasionally something more puzzling. On a misty morning, much like any other, quarrymen chiseled away at the pale rock face when their tools struck something hard, something massive. What emerged from the chalk wasn't merely stone, but a fragment of Jawa jaw larger than the shovel that had uncovered it. The workers might have paused, leaning on their tools, regarding this artifact with a mixture of curiosity and ancient superstition. Here was evidence of something enormous that had once walked the English countryside, something that existed only in memory and myth. The jaw was heavy and stone-like, with teeth as long as a man's finger. Perhaps one of the older quarrymen whispered what everyone was thinking: dragon bones. These remarkable fragments made their way to the homes of local collectors, wealthy gentlemen who maintained private museums in spare rooms. The bones travelled in cloth-wrapped parcels, carefully transported by cart along rutted country roads, from the chalky quarry face to Oxford's academic sanctuary. The journey these fossils took was nothing compared to their voyage through time remains that had lain undisturbed for 166 million years, now suddenly exposed to human eyes. In the reverent quiet of Victorian drawing rooms, amateur scientists and natural philosophers gathered around tables where these massive fragments lay displayed on velvet cloth. Imagine the scene: oil lamps casting a warm glow on serious faces, the occasional clink of a teacup being returned to its saucer, and the rustle of paper as notes were taken. These were the settings where dragons were transformed by science, where myth gave way to a new understanding of Earth's ancient past. The most significant of these fossils eventually found their way to the hands of William Buckland, Oxford's first professor of geology. Picture him hunched over his desk, examining the massive jawbone by lamplight, comparing it to drawings of living creatures and finding no match. In 1824, in that very same drawing room atmosphere of scientific discovery, Buckland gave this creature its name, Megalosaurus, great lizard. With that single act of naming, the first dinosaur officially entered scientific literature, though the word dinosaur itself wouldn't be coined for another 18 years. Buckland couldn't possibly have known what he had started. What began in that quiet Oxford study would eventually grow into a scientific revolution, rewriting our understanding of Earth's history. The dragons of folklore, it seemed, had a basis in reality, after all, not as fire-breathing monsters, but as genuine creatures of flesh and bone that had ruled our planet for millions of years. As these discoveries multiplied through the 19th century, these ancient bones captured not just scientific minds but the public imagination as well. Artists began to envision what these creatures might have looked like in life. Early reconstructions were, by modern standards, charmingly inaccurate. The Megalosaurus, often depicted as a massive, four-legged beast resembling an oversized iguana or a salamander of impossible proportions. The very first full reconstruction, created for the Crystal Palace exhibition of 1854, showed Megalosaurus as exactly the kind of lumbering monster that might have populated medieval dragon tales. And so we arrive at a gentle irony of history. The dragons that had frightened generations of children were now returning to their bedrooms not as terrors, but as wonders. Picture books began to feature these ancient creatures, transforming the fearsome dragons of folklore into educational marvels. Children who might once have trembled at tales of St. George's dragon now fell asleep clutching illustrated guides to dinosaurs, their dreams filled not with terror but with wonder at the strange world that existed before humanity. Victorian parents, leaning over their children's beds, pointed to pictures of Megalosaurus and other newly discovered dinosaurs, creating new bedtime stories about ancient worlds. These aren't make-believe. They might have said, these really existed. The great circle was complete. The bones that superstitious quarrymen had once called dragon remains had, through science, become something simultaneously more mundane and more wondrous, real creatures from a past so distant it might as well have been myth. In this way, the dragons never truly left us. They merely transformed, shedding scales of superstition for the bones of science, trading fire breath for fossil evidence. The Megalosaurus, that first named dinosaur, built a bridge between our world of myth and the actual prehistoric pasta connection that continues to captivate us to this day as we stand in museums, gazing up at mounted skeletons, still feeling that ancient thrill of dragon stories. In the hushed scriptoriums of medieval monasteries, where candlelight cast long shadows across carefully inked parchments, monks transcribed warnings of a creature so terrifying that its very glance meant certain death. The basilisk, they wrote with trembling hands, was born of impossible origins, a serpent hatched from the egg of a rooster, incubated by a toad beneath the waning summer moon. Their illuminated manuscripts depicted this abomination with the head of a rooster, the body of a serpent, and sometimes the wings of a bat, a chimeric creature whose breath withered plants, whose touch cracked stone, and whose gaze brought instantaneous death. The name basilisk itself whispers its royal lineage. from the Greek basiliskos, meaning little king, a creature so powerful that even the king of beasts, the lion, would flee at its approach. Pliny the Elder, that meticulous Roman naturalist who documented the known world's wonders and terrors alike, described the basilisk as a small serpent with a distinctive mark on its head resembling a crown. A creature no longer than 12 fingers in length, yet possessing such potent venom that it left a trail of withered earth in its wake. These stories traveled slowly across medieval Europe, gaining elaborate details with each retelling. By the 12th century, Alexander Neckham suggested that the only defense against a basilisk was to hold a mirror before it, forcing the creature to witness its own deadly gaze and perish by its own power. Others claimed that the crow of a rooster would kill it instantly, a fitting end for a creature born of rooster's egg, yet twisted into something unnatural. Monastery records from northern Italy tell of villages keeping white roosters as guardians against basilisks, their morning calls ensuring safety for another day. But perhaps these ancient scribes, in their dimly lit cells, were attempting to understand something real, something that exists even now in the dense forests of Southeast Asia, something that does indeed rise like a staff, holding itself eerily still as if frozen in time. In the emerald depths of Thailand's forests, where sunlight filters through layers of leaves in dappled patterns, the king cobra performs its ancient ritual. Unlike its serpentine cousins who remain close to the ground, this magnificent creature can raise the front third of its body vertically, reaching heights taller than a human. Its movement is deliberate, almost ceremonial, as it rises in slow motion, expanding its distinctive hood, a fan of elongated ribs covered by elastic skin that transforms its slender neck into an imposing shield. Travelers who have witnessed this display describe a peculiar sensation, not quite fear, though fear is certainly present, but something deeper, more primal. The cobra's unblinking gaze seems to lock with yours, its vertical pupils focused entirely on your presence. Its body sways almost imperceptibly, a gentle motion like wheat bending in a summer breeze. This swaying isn't random but carefully calculated, a hypnotic rhythm that seems to blur the boundaries between predator and prey, between movement and stillness. Local legends tell of forest wanderers who became snake-struck, unable to move after encountering the cobra's gaze, standing frozen until the serpent made its decision to strike or to slide silently away. These stories echo the ancient basilisk myths with surprising fidelity, a creature whose gaze paralyzes, whose presence commands absolute attention. The biology behind this mesmerizing display reveals a delicate interplay of evolutionary adaptations. The hood expansion serves multiple purposes, making the snake appear larger to potential threats, creating an unmistakable warning signal and preparing the body for either fight or flight. The muscles controlling this display have evolved specifically for this purpose, allowing the snake to maintain this posture for remarkable periods without fatigue. The cobra's famous swaying motion, which has inspired centuries of snake charming traditions, serves a practical purpose beyond its hypnotic effect on humans. This gentle oscillation helps the cobra track multiple targets simultaneously, its sensitive vision detecting the slightest movements against the background. What appears to us as a hypnotic dance is actually a sophisticated tracking system, constantly recalibrating, constantly assessing the situation with cold precision. Perhaps most fascinating is the cobra's ability to maintain absolute stillness between movements, a frozen moment where time seems suspended. This stillness is a hunting strategy, allowing the snake to conserve energy while remaining absolutely focused. In these moments of perfect stillness, the cobra's metabolic rate actually slows, its breathing becomes almost imperceptible, creating an unsettling sense of something between living and non-living. The basilisk lizard of Central American rainforests shares this quality of mythic presence. Though unrelated to the cobra, this remarkable reptile performs its own seemingly impossible feat, running across water on its hind legs, its splayed feet creating tiny air pockets that prevent sinking. Ancient peoples who witnessed this Jesus Christ lizard walking on water might easily have attributed supernatural powers to the creature, perhaps contributing to the complex mythology surrounding these animals. In these real creatures, we find echoes of the basilisk myths, not in deadly gazes or poisonous breath, but in the profound stillness, the hypnotic movements, and the commanding presence that can indeed freeze a human observer in their tracks. The monks in their scriptoriums weren't entirely wrong. They were simply interpreting the natural world through the lens of wonder available to them. In the pale lavender light of Arctic dawn, when the world seems made of nothing but ice and silence, something magical happens. The frozen sea exhales, not through lungs, but through the scattered breathing holes where whales surface between hunting dives. Pillars of mist rise like spectral columns, hanging in the motionless air before dissolving back into the cold. This is the realm of the narwhal, a creature whose very existence seems improbable even now. Picture yourself on the edge of an ice floe, the horizon a perfect straight line dividing white from deeper white. The temperature hovers around 30 degrees below zero. Your breath forms tiny ice crystals that sparkle briefly before falling to the ground like diamond dust. And then you see it, a pale grey shape gliding beneath transparent young ice, and rising from its head, a twisted spear of ivory that can reach 10 feet in length. The narwhal, Monodon monoceros, the one tooth, one horn, the living unicorn of the sea. But imagine seeing this spiraled tusk without the creature attached, washed ashore on some Nordic beach after a storm. No wonder the medieval mind, already primed for wonders, saw evidence of unicorns. No wonder sailors returned with tales of mermaids armed with ivory spears. In the half-light between science and mythology, the narwhal swam unnoticed for centuries, hidden by human imagination. The tusk became more valuable than gold, more precious than rubies. By the 1500s, unicorn horn commanded prices that would bankrupt minor kingdoms. Queen Elizabeth I paid the modern equivalent of 5 million for a single specimen that became part of the crown jewels. The Danish throne was said to be made entirely of unicorn horn, though it was indeed narwhal tusk all along. But why such extraordinary value? The medieval mind was haunted by poison. Kings and queens never ate without fear, and the wealthy sought protection through magical means. The unicorn horn gained its astronomical worth from the belief that it could detect poison. Place it in a cup containing tainted wine, and the horn would supposedly sweat, bubble, or change color. Royal tasters carried small pieces as protective amulets. In the courts of Tudor England, elaborate golden holders were crafted specifically to dip these twisted ivory wands into suspicious drinks. What delicious irony that an actual marine mammal from the furthest north was saving royal lives across Europe, not through any magical property, but through simple chemistry. The highly porous ivory would indeed react with certain compounds found in common poisons of the day, science masquerading as magic, wrapped in the soft cloak of myth. The reality of the narwhal is perhaps more fascinating than the legends it spawned. That spectacular tusk is actually a single elongated tooth that emerges through the upper lip and grows throughout the animal's life, spiraling counterclockwise. Almost exclusively found in males, it contains millions of highly sensitive nerve endings. Imagine having a tooth the length of your body, capable of sensing minute changes in water temperature, salinity, and perhaps even detecting prey. Beneath the Arctic ice, narwhals communicate through clicks and whistles, navigating a world where darkness reigns for months at a time. They dive deeper than almost any other mammal, plunging nearly a mile beneath the surface in search of halibut, cod, and squid. Their clicking echoes map the underside of the ice sheets, helping them find the next breathing hole, the difference between life and death in their frozen world. Recent studies suggest the tusk may serve multiple purposes, perhaps as a sensory organ, perhaps for dominance displays when males engage in tusking contests, gently fencing with these extraordinary teeth. Or perhaps they stun prey by tapping them with the tusk. The truth likely combines all these functions, as nature rarely evolves such dramatic features for single purposes. What remains most remarkable is how such a creature could remain wrapped in mythology for so long. European nobles paid fortunes for these tusks without understanding the living animal that grew them. The sea unicorn, or mermaid spear, was traded along routes stretching from Greenland through Norway to the centers of European power, carried by merchants who may have occasionally glimpsed the living animal but kept such knowledge to themselves, protecting the value of their magical wares. In this quiet corner of natural history, we find a perfect illustration of how the human imagination fills in gaps in our knowledge. We needed unicorns, so we found them. We needed protection from poison, so we created it. And swimming through it all, unaware of the legends they inspired, the narwhals continued their ancient patterns beneath the ice, the clicking of their sonar the only sound in a world of profound silence. In the layered histories of Earth's oceans, certain shadows loom larger than others. The Megalodona name derived from Greek, meaning big tooth, swam through warm Miocene and Pliocene waters between 23 and 3.6 million years ago. Yet, unlike the familiar dinosaurs whose bones we've reassembled into museum sentinels, this prehistoric shark left behind primarily teeth-massive, triangular serrated fossils that hint at jaws potentially stretching 20 feet wide. We find ourselves drawn to creatures that confirm our relative smallness. The blue whale, still with us, offers some comfort in its gentle filtration of krill. But Megalodon was a predator whose body likely stretched beyond 60 feet, 3 times longer than today's great white shark. Its teeth, some measuring over 7 inches in diagonal length, tell us this was no mere fish, but an evolutionary pinnacle of predation. The largest shark that ever lived, feeding on the largest whales that ever lived, in an ancient ocean we can barely imagine. Where ancient seas once covered what became our continents, Megalodon teeth occasionally emerge from North Carolina phosphate beds, arid Chilean deserts, and Australian coastal cliffs. Each triangular fossil represents a fragment of an animal, so massive it would have displaced over 50 tons of water with each languid movement. Their teeth fall from rotting gums throughout their lives, a constant replacement that scattered perhaps millions across ancient seafloors, some eventually preserved within sedimentary tombs. In the blackwater depths of our planet's oceans, these fossil teeth have drifted down for millions of years, settling onto abyssal plains like sinking stars. Divers occasionally find them lodged in submarine canyons or half buried in continental shelves. Each tooth carries its own small gravitia-dense mineral remembrance, pointing toward an animal otherwise lost to time. Hold one in your palm, and you hold evidence of a predator so perfectly adapted that its hunting strategies required warm global oceans and massive marine mammalsa combination our cooling Pliocene planet eventually could no longer provide. The Victorian era, with its characteristic fascination for natural wonders, gave particular attention to these massive tooth fossils. Naturalists debated their origin, collectors sought them for curiosity cabinets, and newspapers that 19th-century ecosystem of sensationalism occasionally reported sailors' accounts of monstrous sharks in remote ocean regions. These accounts followed a familiar template, a distant observation, a brief shadowy form beneath tropical waters, a suggestion that perhaps, in some uncharted ocean trench, survivors might still patrol. An 1873 edition of the Queensland Gazette described a sea monster of extraordinary dimensions sighted by the crew of the merchant vessel Pauline off the coast of Australia. In 1918, Australian naturalist David Stead recorded the testimony of Zane Grey, who claimed lobster fishermen had encountered a shark of almost unbelievable proportions. Victorian and early 20th century newspapers transformed these ambiguous encounters into promises of living Leviathan creatures that had somehow evaded extinction in hidden oceanic trenches. The popular imagination seized upon these accounts, creating a mythology of survival against overwhelming scientific evidence. The seafaring tradition of the one that got away found its ultimate expression in tales of living megalodons. Each generation has repackaged this hope in different forms, from newspaper accounts to pulp adventure stories to modern cable television specials suggesting what if. This persistence reveals less about ocean ecology than about our reluctance to accept that nature's most perfect predators could vanish completely. Yet our contemporary understanding of deep ocean ecosystems offers little comfort to those hoping for megalodon's survival. Modern sonar mapping has charted the topography of ocean trenches with increasing precision. Research vessels deploying sophisticated equipment have documented life in the deepest marine environments. Remote submersibles have photographed bizarre creatures adapted to crushing pressures and perpetual darkness, transparent shrimp, bioluminescent fish, and bottom-dwelling organisms sustained by chemical rather than solar energy. What these explorations have not revealed is any evidence of 60-foot apex predators. The sonar silence surrounding Megalodon becomes more conclusive with each passing decade, tranquil, final confirmation that some ecological niches, once emptied, remain vacant. The deep ocean trenches have yielded many biological surprises, but none approaching the scale of what would be required to sustain a breeding population of massive warm-water predators. The true legacy of Megalodon lives not in hidden ocean corners, but in the evolutionary pressures it once exerted. Modern whale species developed their impressive speeds, complex communication systems, and cooperative behaviors partially in response to predation pressures that no longer exist. When Megalodon vanished during the cooling oceans of the late Pliocene, it left behind not just scattered teeth but evolutionary echoes that still ripple through marine ecosystems. Sometimes extinction itself becomes a creative force, reshaping the descendants of those who survived. In the end, perhaps Megalodon's greatest gift to us is this reminder: even the most perfectly adapted creatures remain vulnerable to planetary change. The black water depths keep their secrets, but they have shared enough fossil evidence for us to appreciate both the magnificent reality of what once was and the humbling certainty of what is no more. Time slips away beneath your pillow as we journey back, far back, to when our planet wore a different face. The Cambrian period, over 500 million years ago, when strange life flourished in ancient seas under skies that had never known a human breath or gaze. These creatures swam and crawled through waters illuminated by a younger sun, their bodies soft and vulnerable, destined to vanish without witness. But some found themselves caught in a miracle of preservation. In the Canadian Rockies, near a place now called Field, British Columbia, there lies a formation known as the Burgess Shale. Here, ancient mud flows entombed countless sea creatures in a gentle apocalypse, sealing them away from time itself. The soft tissues that would normally decay within days were instead pressed like flowers between pages of midnight stone, their outlines and sometimes even cellular details perfectly preserved for our drowsy contemplation today. These fossils sleep within the rock, dreamlike impressions of beings so strange they challenge our understanding of life itself. They rest there, layer upon layer, like the sheets of your bed, each one holding creatures suspended in eternal slumber, waiting 500 million years for human eyes to finally witness their peculiar forms. Among these dreamers from deep time, perhaps none captures the essence of weirdness quite like hallucigenia. Its very name whispers of hallucinations, of reality bent and twisted into forms that seem impossible yet undeniably existed. When paleontologists first uncovered this creature in the 1970s, they struggled to make sense of what they were seeing. A worm-like body no longer than your thumb, bristling with rigid spines on one side and soft, tentacle-like appendages on the other. But which way was up? Which end was the head? For decades, scientists depicted hallucigenia walking on its spines like stilts, with its tentacles waving above like searching fingers. The creature entered our collective imagination this way, an absurd parade of spined worms tottering across ancient seafloors on impossibly thin legs. Children's books illustrated them this way. Museum dioramas arranged them thus. A generation grew up believing that these bizarre, stilted creatures once populated our oceans. The truth, revealed only in recent years through more careful examination, was that we had hallucigenia completely upside down and back to front. Those stilts weren't legs at all, but protective spines projecting from its back. The tentacles were indeed its walking limbs, and what had been identified as its head was actually its tail. Even more remarkably, what everyone had missed was a simple, bulbous head with two simple eyes and a ring of teeth hidden within, a face from 500 million years ago finally revealed, as if waking from a dream of mistaken identity. Imagine drifting now, your consciousness hovering above that ancient seabed. The water is warm around you, sunlight filtering down in wavering beams. Below, tiny hallucigenia creatures pick their way across the ocean floor on their soft tentacle legs, their spines pointing upward like protection against the vastness above. They move slowly, unhurried, unaware that their kind would one day become one of the most misunderstood fossils ever discovered. As you sink deeper into sleep, consider how these odd creatures connect to our world today. Hallucigenia, we now know, belongs to a group that may be ancestors to modern velvet worms, creatures that still crawl through forest floors in warm regions of our world. This is the gentle wonder of deep time, that the truly weird and vanished shapes of ancient days still echo in the familiar creatures that share our planet. The Burgess Shale and its dreamlike menagerie remind us that life has always been experiment, always strange, always beautiful in its capacity for variation. As you drift towards slumber, imagine these ancient seas washing against the shores of your consciousness. The weird has always been with us, will always be with us. Strange life forms come and go across the vast expanse of Earth's history, each one perfect in its moment, each one eventually yielding to change. Tonight, as you float on the edge of sleep, know that you rest within the same continuum as Hallucigenia and all the other mysterious creatures of the Burgess Shale. Your dreams join theirs across the vast gulf of time, preserved not in stone but in the quiet wonder of existence itself. Let the gentle waves of ancient seas rock you towards sleep, cradled in the knowledge that the weird and wonderful have always been here, and always will be.